Background stamps are one of the hardworking heroes of the craft room, and I even surprised myself how versatile they can be as I made this video. My intent was to come up with 3 or 4 ways to use them, but I ended up stopping myself at 7 cards, including one that needed to be rescued. Let's get started. Before we get to the background stamps, I'm creating a background for my background, so to speak, by randomly and very roughly blending some autumn-colored inks onto my panel of white cardstock. I'll be die cutting this panel later, so the texture is actually going to be a good thing, and I'm not worrying at all about smoothness. Next, it's time to start with the easiest technique. Just stamp the background. I've got an old red rubber background that's 6 by 6 inches. Because of the foam on the back of my stamp, I need to remove the foam from my MISTI, and to help me get pattern all over my cardstock panels, I'm going to use a MISTI corner to help me place them away from the edges, but in a place that I can still put them back into if I need to restamp. I do have to remove the corner to get back to that flat surface before I put the stamp down. I'm inking my geometric pattern with Twilight ink, and that'll give me a nice subtle tone-on-tone look on my white background panel. Then I do it all over again with the ink blended panel. MISTI corner, line up the panel, ink it up, remove the corner, and stamp it down. To finish the card, I cut the white panel with 2 rectangle dies, and I created a negative frame between them where my dark teal card base can show through. I cut 3 maple leaves from my colored panel, and I popped them up down the left side of my card and intertwined them with my slimline thanks sentiment cut from gold satin cardstock. Next is technique 2 and 3. Again, it's a red rubber stamp, so no foam in my MISTI. And this time I'm showing you that if you don't have MISTI corners, you can just use the grid marks on the MISTI base to line up your panel, so that if you need to restamp, which I will be doing, you know exactly where to put it back. I have a bit of temporary adhesive on the base of the MISTI to help keep the panel from shifting when I pick up the stamp with the MISTI door. This time I'm stamping in Copic friendly ink because I want to do some coloring. I'm not worried about how well I'm stamping now because I will be doing some overstamping later. I grabbed a light and dark shade that match each of the colors in my color palette, and I got down to coloring all those little leaves. I started by putting my lightest shade of green down on a random selection of leaves. Then, to get a stained glass look, I outlined each leaf with the darker shade. Then I moved on to yellow, red, teal, and burgundy. Then I colored my background. I started by placing shadows under the leaves with the darker gray marker, and I finished by filling in the rest with the lighter gray. Because the leaves are close together, it wasn't a lot of work, and I didn't really worry about making sure that it was perfectly smooth. The next step was to put the panel back into the MISTI for the overstamping. Pro tip, make sure you remember which end of the panel was up. You could mark the back of your panel so you remember. This time I inked up the stamp with embossing ink, which is sticky and holds on to the gold embossing powder that I sprinkled over top. I put the panel into my foil-lined lid and I heated it until the gold powder was all melted and shiny. Using this lid means I'm not trying to hold on to the panel while I'm heating it, and my fingers stay safe, and I think the foil reflects back the heat and helps reduce warping. Now after all that work, I want to get at least 2 cards out of this panel, and by cutting it up this way, I could have gotten 3, but then I had a different idea. But first, I used that frame. I popped it up over a burgundy panel and I added a gold die-cut sentiment along with some pearls and jewels. For my second card, I used the inner square and I added some stickles to each of the leaves. This is still my favorite no-mess way to add glitter to my cards. I did the same with this strip. And then because the leaves don't overlap each other, I was able to fussy cut a few of them out with my scissors. This is a great way to stretch a background stamp with this kind of pattern on it. Now the leaves act as if they were stamped individually. I added them directly to my white card base and they add a great look of movement to this card. Next is the card that needed to be rescued. This time I'm using a clear background stamp, so that means I leave the foam in the MISTI. And this time I can probably get right into that corner, so I won't use the corner tool. I'm using watercolor cardstock with my embossing ink before pouring the gold embossing powder over and melting it until it's shiny. And now comes the part where I kind of wrecked this card. I grabbed some watercolor powders and some water and I tried to get a particular look. I've done this technique successfully in the past, but today it just wasn't going my way. Or I was too impatient. I probably should have left it to dry before deciding, but I blotted it and I ended up more with a wash of color, which looks okay, but it wasn't what I was hoping for. Sprays to the rescue. I grabbed a couple of old mica sprays and some Distress Oxide sprays in my color palette, and I played until I got some more vibrant colors on my panel. In the end, I still don't love it, but it was closer to what I wanted. And I could have just left it like this and used it as one piece, but that geometric pattern gave me another option. I trimmed it down into strips, turned them, and placed them to still give me the pattern, but also to give me more variety in the color. I inlaid a gold die cut over a gold mat, as well as the pearls and jewels. Next is another clear background stamp, but this one's a turnabout stamp. I'm using the turnabout jig that helps you place an A2 panel right in the center of it, but you could use a 6x6 inch piece of cardstock and get the same result. I inked the stamp with the first color and I stamped it down. Then I turned the panel, cleaned the stamp, and inked it with my next color, and I stamped it again. One of the reasons I love this particular turnabout stamp is that it looks great stamped just once, or twice, or 3 times. You can get more looks from this one stamp. But this time I did all 4 colors and 4 turns, and I got a filled in but still random looking dotted pattern. Next, I inked the stamp with my embossing ink, and I stamped and turned all 4 times. This will allow me to use clear embossing powder over all the dots, and once the powder is melted, those bright colors will be protected. Next, I blend the dark teal ink over top of the dots until the full panel is covered. I know it looks like the dots are getting covered as I'm working, but once I'm done, I grabbed a clean cloth and I wiped the excess ink off the embossing ink, and now I'm ready to go. Before I show you one of the cards I made with this panel, I need to show you another very quick and easy technique with this background stamp that just has very closely spaced, uneven lines. There's actually a ton you can do with this. You could stamp it once on a blended panel as I did here, or you could stamp it and turn it and change your colors even. This is another great basic to have, and it adds texture and interest in seconds. Okay, so here's my card. I combined my embossed dots with the tone-on-tone textured panel. It's a very simple layout, but between the dots and the lines, there's a ton of interest, and still a little white space to help me breathe, with the outside frame and the shadow under the die-cut sentiment. Now I'm back to a red rubber stamp, but this one has pretty big solid dots, and that opens up a whole lot of possibilities. I grabbed my color palette of Zig Art and Graphic markers. These markers are water-based, and they allow me to randomly color the stamp, so I'll end up with a panel of multicolored dots. You can see that the ink is kind of pooling on the dots, so I'm not going to get a very precise pattern, but that's okay. When I got it all filled in, I spritzed the stamp with some water and then closed the door on a watercolor panel. I let it sit for a few seconds to give the ink some time to transfer into the paper, and I was so pleased with the result when I lifted it up. This card is another one with a very simple layout. I really wanted those happy dots to be the star of the show, so I used a gray mat and some gold stacked up letters as my sentiment. Because I had cut down both my dotted panels, I still had leftovers, and what could be better than dots? Double dots! One of the things that amazed me about background stamps as I put this video together was not only are there a ton of techniques you can do with them, there's then a million things you can do with the backgrounds you created. I've still got lots of ideas that'll have to go into a sequel. What's your favorite technique with a background stamp? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.